I recently sat down with Angel Pérez, the CEO of the National Association of College Admission Counselors, and according to Forbes, the most influential voice in college admission. And we recorded a 3-part podcast. And in part 1, I really wanted you to get to know who Angel is beyond the title. You know, beneath the surface, what are his core values? What does he care about? And I thought it'd be fun to do it with, what else? Brainstorming his personal statement. So I pitched this idea to him, and you can see at the beginning of the video, he was a little uncomfortable at first, but eventually he leaned into it. And thank you, Angel, bless you, for being willing to get into that and just to be vulnerable with me. I really appreciate it. So that's part 1. That's sort of looking at the past. And then part 2 is looking at the present. We talk about self-care. And this is sort of picking up on our conversation on last year's podcast on self-care. And for those of you counselors who are caretakers and achievers like we are, what we look at, and I ask Angel, is what are some areas where you feel like things are going well? And where do you feel like you still need to do some work? So this is kind of an update and, a deep dive into self-care. Then we shift in part 3 and we talk about the future of college admission. So where does Angel see the profession going? You know, based on his conversations with Congress, like, is college still worth it? What does he think about that? And lots more. So I hope you enjoyed this conversation. I hope you enjoyed as much as I did. And let's get into it. Hi, Angel. Welcome to the podcast.
So good to see you.
It's good to be with you.
Good to be here in person.
In person.
Yeah.
We have our official fireside jet with our actual fire. We brought it in especially for you.
I love it.
Yep.
It's cold in California right now.
It's
Can
cold.
you believe it, friends?
It's cold. It was expensive, but it was worth it for this particular podcast. All right. So one of the things I thought would be fun is to brainstorm a personal statement.
Ooh, okay. I'm nervous.
Yeah. And,
I haven't written one in a very long time.
It's been a minute?
Yes,
Yeah.
It's been a minute. Grad school.
Grad school.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Grad school. I forgot about that. I did write a personal statement for
Long
grad school.
time ago.
So the prep that we did for this, I gave you this values exercise, really just like today before we showed up. And what I thought we could do is we could delve into, I'm just going to kind of ask you some questions around this. And the prompt, big picture that I'm wanting to plant for you is something like, if you were today from your current position in your working world to answer the question in a page, describe the world you come from and how it's shaped your dreams and aspirations, what would that look like? And the prompt that I'm using is the old University of California prompt, later became an MIT prompt, but it's one that I really love because I think it has the potential to get us turning inwardly and to sort of reflect. So
Okay.
I'm definitely not promising we're going to have, and you don't have homework after this, unless you want to.
I feel like I'm back in school. You're making me nervous, Ethan. Okay.
So I'd love to just hear, so based on the values exercise, you started with 10, you went down to 5, and then you landed on 3. I'd love to hear a little bit about what are some of the top 3 values that you landed on?
I think it was hard to choose top 3. And I think it depends on where you are in your life. But right now, I chose health and fitness, meaningful work, and trust as my top 3.
Oh, juicy. So I'd love for you to I'm just double clicking on all 3. So whichever one you feel like sharing about, I'd just love to hear more about your either journey with or your interest in that particularly in your life right now.
Yeah, I'll start with health and fitness. I just think it's been something that I've been on a journey with for the past several years. And I'm realizing that without it, I'm off kilter, I'm off center. And so it has to be core to my everyday. I think also now as I get older, and it's not just because of this particular job that I have, but that I see the importance of meaningful work. Like work is the most time we spend outside of our homes and, without our families. And so to spend all that time and not find meaning and purpose and joy in it would be, I think, soul crushing.
And before we get to trust, I want to ask for the first one, let's talk health and fitness. Like when you think about health and fitness in your life, what does that look like? How does that manifest itself? Give me an image. Like what does health and fitness look like?
Yeah, for some reason, when you say image, I think of like me doing a yoga pose. Not because that's the only thing I do. I like to do a variety of different things, but because in a yoga studio, I tend to find stillness. It's much more than about the physical. It's also about the mental. And so for me, health and fitness is, I think oftentimes people will think, oh, that's because you go and you work out at a gym. And for me, it's about holistic living, mental and physical.
And is that something that's always been important to you? Or you mentioned a journey. Like, how has that gone for you?
No, actually, I would say it's become more and more important as I've aged. I was not the healthiest child or teenager, I will tell you that. I did not have good modeling. But as I've aged, I realized that that's just core to who I am. But I think you're always on a journey there because you can fall off the wagon pretty quickly or things take over. I know you and I have talked about this, that, you know, you struggle with it as well. So I've now put it at the top because I think it feeds everything else in my life.
Yeah. Great. I want to shift to meaningful work for a minute. So when you think about what meaningful work looks like practically, when you're doing meaningful work or when you're in that mode or in that zone, what's the image that comes up for you? Or
for me, meaningful work is when I am in flow. And so it means that I could keep going and going and I don't even notice the time pass. And so, I mean, I'm very fortunate that if you ask me for an image, I think about what I do on a day-to-day basis at NACAC. I feel like what I do is meaningful work. And so I picture myself, the first image that comes up is conference, even though we do a lot more than conference, but it's the culmination of our year. And it's where everybody comes together and I get to see, it's almost a physical manifestation of what we do. And so being at conference and opening the conference and looking out at thousands of people who have come to this place to be refueled and to be educated and to connect on a human level with people, to me, I'm like, wow, this is really powerful. This is meaningful.
like, what were some of the values that were important to you then that are still really important to you?
I think I've always, even as a child, I always wanted to help other people. And so for me, all of the work that I have done, even when I think back to like my high school age jobs, I didn't connect the dots at the time, but I chose jobs that were in the service of other people. Yeah. And I am certainly in a job now where I am in the service of other people. Totally. So I could have done that through law, but I found law dreadfully boring, and it is a perfectly wonderful career for other people, just not for me.
Yeah. What's your relationship to trusting? Is it easy for you to trust, or does it take time for you to build it, to warm up? Like, what's your orientation towards trust?
I often say that I trust deeply unless it's proven otherwise, right? So my inclination is to trust people. In fact, one of the values, my leadership team and I, when we first came together, we talked about what are the values that we will each uphold. And one of them is assume best intentions. Yeah. And so we assume best intentions of each other. And I tend to lean in that direction. Yeah.
So I'd love to pivot just a little bit to talk about another exercise that you worked on just briefly. And it's this identities one. Can I shift?
Yes.
Because
more homework from the college essay guy.
It's this one here. So I want to talk about identities and then potentially make connections back to values. But I'd love for you to just scan this. And for those of you at home who are wondering what the heck this is an exercise that we'll link to it below the video, which is just thinking about what are different identities that have shaped you in particular ways. And so I'm curious, as you scan this list of different identities, if you had to say, these are some of the identities that have least shaped me, or like one identity that has shaped me least, what would you start with? If you had to cross it off and you think it would have the lowest impact on, your life, who you are in this world?
That's a hard one, because I think every single thing on this list impacts you in one way, shape, or form. But the one that comes to mind is physical appearance. Is probably, I don't think about it very often, even though I know that my physical appearance is how I carry myself in the world, right? But I would say probably of all the things on this list, that one I feel like hasn't impacted me as much. Yeah.
I'd love to know, in terms of the identities that you've named here, is there an identity that you don't necessarily lead with, or when people are getting to know you, it's not something that you bring up maybe in a first conversation, but as they get to know you, they get to understand just how much this particular identity has shaped you, has informed who you are.
Yeah, again, I could go with a lot of them, but I think I'll share this one because of where I currently am in my life. And so you asked about religion, and that's been an interesting trajectory in my life. Religion was a big part of my childhood, and then I left religion, and I wrote down here seeker, and that's not something I would like share with people off the street. I wouldn't be like, I'm a seeker. Let me tell you what that is. But it's that I don't identify with one particular faith, but I consider myself very spiritual and constantly seeking and looking for answers about life. Like, what is this all about? What is this experience and journey that we're all on as humans? So I certainly would not lead with that. And I think that people need to get to know me. We get into those conversations, but now thousands of people are watching it. So, there goes that.
So let me ask a kind of heavy-handed question, but it's like, in terms of the experiences in your life that have led you to becoming a seeker, like, what do you think have been the big influences that brought you to this point where you go, I guess I am a seeker now?
Yeah, I don't know, Ethan. I feel like I'm on Oprah and you're about to make me cry. Like I'm about to burst into tears. I think it's a lot of different things. One, I grew up in a Catholic family who then converted to Seventh-day Adventist. Like there's a lot of stuff there. Thank goodness for therapy. But I think that certainly has had an impact on me. I've always been very curious about religion. Like I actually think if I went back to college today, I would be a religion major. I just want to like dig deep into all the different faiths around the world and why do people believe what they do and what inspires people. But I would say most recently, what has motivated me were two things. Was an episode with burnout, which you and I did a podcast about. Yeah. But I will be honest, it was also becoming NACAC CEO. And it was because I arrived at this moment where like technically you're at the peak of your career. And if I'm 100% transparent with you, I thought it would feel better. And I think it was if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Like you need fuel, food, shelter, all of that. And I had sort of like arrived at this point where I felt great about a lot of aspects of my life. But I was still asking this bigger question about like, what is this all about? And by the way, it happens to a lot of people, I think in your 40s, some people call it midlife crisis. I called it a midlife awakening. I like that term better than crisis. But I think that's what helped me like lean in a little bit more where I'm like, oh, I actually want to connect to something deeper than just work. Yeah. So I'm grateful it happened, but I would say it happened to me over the past several years.
Yeah. I love this. I also think about this identities exercise as like, there are identities that we've sort of left behind, and then there are identities that we're like calling in.
Yes.
And the ones that we're sort of leaning into. I'm curious if there's another one on there that you've either left behind, something that you're like, I don't really identify with this as much as I used to, or if there's an identity here that you like maybe felt edgy to write down, but you're like, yeah, no, that is an identity that I'm leaning into.
I'm being vulnerable, so I'm just going to keep going. I struggle. People ask me about my economic background, and I've been very open about. I was a low-income, first-generation kid, and that obviously has informed my college journey, what I'm passionate about. But I am no longer that. I live a very privileged life, and very grateful for it. But
yeah, what's that like? What's that like to go through that transition?
I mean, it's incredible only because, and it's incredible and I still struggle with it because I feel like I've lived in these two identities. But, I'm grateful that I lived this life I could not have imagined for myself. And I have these incredible opportunities. I'm sitting in California with you today, recording this podcast. So to me, the one that I probably struggle with is that class identity, because I know what it's like to have nothing, and I know what it's like to be well off and to not worry anymore. So living in those two spaces is really interesting. And by the way, between family and friends, I have people in my life across all of those spectrums.
Yeah.
And so going back and forth between those identities is also interesting and challenging and rich in so many different ways.
Yeah. I want to double click on that just for a second. I was like, what is that experience of being able to, have the experience of having not grown up with money, and now to have the experience of like having money and being financially, solid? Like, what do you feel like that affords you in life? Like what perspectives, or what is that teaching you?
Yeah. I mean, I think for so many of us, it affords us security, right? I mean, I think for so long, and by the way, again, it's not always perfect.
Yeah.
I will tell you that one thing that I struggle with, and by the way, many of my friends who grew up low income and have really good careers and are financially stable now, they still in the back of their minds have this little thing that says it could go away tomorrow. And I certainly have that. And so it's not always one of those things where you switch on the light switch and it's like, okay, I'm no longer low income. When you have grown up and seen poverty and experienced that for so long, you start thinking about what if I go back there? What if I move backwards? What if I lose my job, right? And so you do think about that.
And I'm curious, how do you think that impacts your day to day, like your week to week or your month to month, like that, either that fear or that just having that life experience? How does that influence your work?
Yeah. Well, I think first of all, I'm grateful for my life experience. I wouldn't take anything back from the way I grew up, despite all the challenges. It just makes you such a deeply empathetic person. I mean, I will never forget a perfect example when I worked at a college, and there was a student who didn't get their reimbursement check, their financial aid reimbursement check. And someone in my financial aid office was quite dismissive about it. Like, we'll get it to the student in a week.
Yeah.
And I got emotional about it because I was like, you have no idea what it's like not to have $5.
Right.
I said, we're going to get him the check today.
Yeah.
And we made it happen, right? So I think it creates this deep level of empathy for me that like, I know what that's like. And so again, I'm grateful for it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I want to like track back what I'm hearing so far. So some of the main values that you talked about, meaningful work is being a big one. Another one that you didn't put in your top 3, but I heard you talk about, was this value of helping others. You talked about trust a little bit. And then a big one for you is health and fitness. Some of the other things you mentioned, you talked about how in terms of identities, there was this identity of like growing up low income and having a relationship to that. And we haven't obviously gone deep into that, but that's impacted the way that you see the world, especially now being part of a different,
absolutely,
income status, as it were. And the other identity, what was the other one? The other one, seeker.
Yes.
That you're in this position now of seeking, and in part that was maybe and so this is something that if we had more time and we were to really go into this, I would be like, do you feel like the seeking part was sort of in concert with the way you've grown up, or in response to the way you grew up? But I imagine it's probably both.
Probably both. Yeah. And depending on what stage of my life I was. Yeah. But to be honest, I mentioned Maslow's hierarchy of needs not to be geeky, but I really do also realize that to a certain extent, my experience was that until I got other needs taken care of in my life, that I felt secure in my career. I had been climbing the academic ranks, and so I went and I got a master's and then I got a PhD. Like, I was just so focused on other things that all of a sudden, again, I become NACAC CEO, and the first inkling was, I thought this was going to feel better. And not that I didn't love it. I love my job, but I thought I was going to feel some sort of like spiritual aha. And it was like, what else is there out there, right? And so to a certain extent, I don't think I would have actually begun to seek had other parts of my life not felt complete.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. To have that freedom to be able to do that.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, what is your working draft of what do you want to be when you grow up?
Oh my gosh, I really struggle with that question. I still don't know what I want to be when I grow up, but I do know that I want to live a well-integrated, whole, and joyful life in whatever form that comes. There goes that seeking again. I would not have responded that way 3 years ago. But, I think oftentimes people when they're asked that question, the immediate thing that comes is job. Right. Like, I want to be a lawyer when I grow up, or I want to get this. And I don't think about it that way anymore. I think about it more as, how do I want to live my life? What are the kinds of experiences I want to have? I'm now at the age, I'm closer to 50 than I am to 40. And so I can see, like, around the corner, I'll be retired in 20 years, right? And so, like, what do I want that to look like? That's really, my draft is like I'm not even in like the first editing phase. Right now, I'm doing a word cloud. That's where I'm at.
Yeah. And what do you sense, and this is back to the values again, what do you sense is, because, what I was talking about in terms of the first draft of the values is like things that are important to you now, but as you sort of vision cast into the future, what do you predict are going to be the important values for you as you, in sort of like, as you grow, change, evolve? What values call out to you?
Yeah, I think there's two. One is change and variety, and it's not new for me. I actually, even as a child, like, I didn't like the same thing. I'm constantly seeking change, change of scenery, environment. I don't think I've lived in the same house for more than like 5 or 6 years. And so I think I will continue to seek that because it's something that feeds me, just change and variety. But the one that really sticks out is number one, in response to your question, is serenity. Yeah.
Say more.
Yeah. I'm in a phase where I am looking for peace. What I would like for myself, not only this year, but moving forward, is how do I find serenity and stillness so that I can function well in the world around me? And I wish that for everybody, actually. I wish that for you. Yeah.
Thanks for saying that. Yeah. You don't have the homework assignment of going and writing a personal statement, but let me just check in. How are you feeling? Worried. Like, how is this going? How did this go for you?
It went better now that I know that I don't have to write an essay at the end of it. I'm like, whew, okay.
The big theme of our podcast last time was self-care. And so I want to pick up in some ways from where we left off, but it's been almost a year. And I'd love to hear how things are going. And I want to offer a framework. And side note to friends, this is something from my friend Duncan, who I'll link more in the show notes. But I want to talk about self-care from the frame of like counting up, in the sense of like from zero, what's going really well. And then I'd love to get practical as we can with things that you feel like practices that are now in place for you that maybe weren't in place a year or 2 years ago. And then I'd love to hear, let's count down from perfection. Like, what are you still working on? What do you still struggle with? Mm-hmm. So let's start with counting up. What's going well?
What's going well? So I think the first thing I'll say is like I remain committed to just my physical health. So even when I'm on the road, I try to go to the gym or run or swim, yoga, things like that I like to do. And it just frames my energy for the day. So it's going really well. The other thing that I would say is something I did last year, and I would definitely recommend to everyone out there, is get rid of all of your notifications.
Yes.
If you see me,
once more for the people in the back. Say again.
I'm obsessed with things like this, my Apple Watch, but what I noticed is it was constantly dinging. And particularly around news. I used to get news notifications, New York Times, LA Times, BBC. Stop it.
Yeah.
I never felt as I got those notifications like I was any more educated about what was happening in the world. So I've also just begun to limit the amount of news that I take in. I give myself like half an hour in the evening and I get myself caught up, but turn off the notifications.
Yes.
And I think the anxiety has just dropped tremendously. And so that's one of the things I highly, highly recommend.
Yeah.
And I would say I've really been pretty good about sticking to my meditation. It's another thing that really, I'm trying to get to 2 times a day, sometimes it's really 1. But at the same time, like it really just calms me. And I think, again, given the state of the world right now, we can all use a little quiet time. And so I would say those 3 things are going really well.
I love it. The phone one really resonates with me. And I want to say a thing that I've done in the last year is the break up with your phone challenge. So I thought it was pretty good about my relationship with my phone, but Catherine Price is an author who has, and we'll link to it in the show notes, a 30-day break up with your phone challenge sends you a text, and it lets you take stock of sort of what's your relationship with your phone currently. And it has you go on a day-long fast where you don't look at your phone at all, which would be pretty edgy. I think for many folks, it was edgy for me.
Yeah.
But gosh, did I feel.
Oh, I can imagine.
Awesome.
I'm going to take that. I would also say even start small. I mean, one thing around my phone that also I've been really good about is that is not the first thing I pick up in the morning.
Yes.
I do not look at my phone in the morning. I get up, I'm like sipping my coffee. I go and I try to do some reading. But I used to immediately, actually, it was my iPad that I would immediately pick up. And again, clicking through the news. What a terrible way to start your day.
Good morning.
Just ingesting,
Good morning, sunshine.
Exactly. You're ingesting negativity all day long. And so now I try to start with quiet reading as opposed to the phone. So maybe start there and then go to a whole day without your phone.
I love that.
That is
I mean,
awesome.
imagine if someone were to walk in the morning and be like, rather than like sort of like a mother or a father like kissing you on the forehead, instead just like, well, here's the day's news, and it's just that anxiety. It's like a tiger jumping into your tent and fear.
It's almost like I call it guardrails.
Yeah.
I've just learned what are the ways that I can protect myself around some of the things that we can't control in the outside world, right? And so oftentimes I can't control what happens the minute I get to work. It's like we're off to the races, but I can control my morning and how I start my day. So I try to protect that as much as I can.
Yeah. I think it would be easy for folks listening to think, well, great, Angel's got it figured out. Ethan, they're good at self-care. So let's count down from perfection. Like, what are some of the things that you feel like you just haven't been able to figure out or get a hold of, or the areas where you're still maybe struggling?
Number one, top of list, highlight, exclamation point, is I have yet to take control of my schedule. I am still tremendously overscheduled. I am still struggling with saying no. And so for me, that is the piece, it's a goal, and I know it's never going to be perfect. Yeah. But if I can admit to you, even just 2 weeks ago, I just sat in the middle of my office in the middle of the day and said to myself, how did this happen to me again? Yeah. I said last year I wasn't going to do this. I wasn't going to overcommit. I wasn't going to have these 8 a.m. to 9 p.m. days, and here I was again. So I still struggle with that, and there are good days and bad days. But I'm already ahead of where I was, which is I'm so much more conscious about it, and I'm not just going with the flow. I'm trying to be much more intentional about how I manage my schedule.
It's reminding me of the learning framework that I learned in grad school, which is like we start with unconscious incompetence, which is like we don't know we're doing a thing wrong and we don't know how to do the thing. And then we move to conscious incompetence, which is like I know now that I'm doing a thing wrong, or less ideally. We move to conscious competence, which is like I know how to do the thing and I know that I'm doing it well. And then ideally we're moving to unconscious competence. So we're moving to a space where we're doing the thing well or differently or more ideally, and we don't even know we're doing it.
It's so interesting. That's how I think about therapy, because oftentimes people think that if you go to therapy, that all of a sudden your behavior is going to change. And it can begin changing over time, but what does change is your consciousness around it, right? You'll be in that moment and you'll say, oh, I'm doing that again. Doesn't mean maybe you do something totally different, but the next step is going to be that consciousness raising. And so I always think about that in therapy.
Yeah. I love what you're saying. And one of the things that the practices that's helped me that I want to share is at the start of the year, I'll basically look at what are my big rocks, we call them. And this is a term from a book that I read. Well, it's in probably a lot of entrepreneurship books, but it's I found it in Rocket Fuel. But in terms of the big rocks, what are the main things I want to be focusing on, and how much of my energy do I want to be devoting to each of these? And essentially, what I do is I rewrite my job description at least once a year, so that I go, all right. So for me, for example, to get really concrete, I want to spend 50% of my time doing what we're doing right now: recording, creating resources, YouTube videos, happy place for me. I want to spend 20% of my time what I call culture tending or culture building. And that means, essentially running team meetings, planning retreats, these kinds of things. So the reason I say this, and I don't need to get into like the whole deal, although I'm not going to link to it in the show notes, but if folks are curious, they can ask me. But I feel like what's useful for me is like practically going, okay, given that I want to spend this much of my time and energy doing this, how does that map out into a given week or month? So for example, if I go, okay, I look at my schedule, because there's the aspirational version, right? And then there's the actual version, like the real deal. Look at the Google Calendar and be like, but how am I actually spending my time? And when I can do that in this sort of down season, quieter time, and of course, creating time for the quieter time, but go, okay, when I'm like in my imagined best self, ideal self, how can I make the best contribution to the world? And then I can just put that up against my calendar for the coming week or month and be like, do these match up or not?
Well, do they match up?
Sort of. Like mostly. For the most part, yeah.
Okay.
And I would say it's like, I'm like 80% of the way there. But it points me to like certain things that I can probably, that I'm still probably holding on to. Yeah. For some particular reason.
That's a really cool exercise. I'm going to take that and try to do it. Although I will tell you, I'm nervous just thinking about it because
Why?
What I may find out is that I am very misaligned. Just because of all the kind of, I have so many different constituencies in this role. And so my time has to be spread in so many different ways. But one of the things, this sort of reminds me that one of the things that I'm trying to get towards is how I dedicate my time to things that only I can uniquely do in the organization. So in terms of impact, I have this rock star team. What are the things that they can do well? And what are the things that only really I can uniquely do? And so as I think about my schedule in the years ahead, I'm trying to get there. So I wonder if maybe layering that question on top of the exercise you're talking about, that could be a good one.
I love that.
Yeah. One of the things I'm getting better at, and I've talked about this publicly before, is I used to have a really hard time saying no.
Yeah.
And now I say no a lot more. I don't say no enough.
Same.
And so I'd like to get there. Any advice? I'll take it. But I do, the question I ask myself is, by saying yes, what aspect of myself am I saying no to? And I'll share, I was recently invited to be a trustee at an institution. And I struggled with the decision for a while. Actually, it took me like 3 months to get back to the president. Partly because I love the institution and I think it would be a fascinating opportunity. But I finally sat with that question, like, what am I saying no to if I say yes to this? And what I realized was that's 4 weekends a year that I'm traveling, that I am not, caring for myself, that I am not even just spending time at home. And so just really proud of myself that I honored myself first with that decision and decided I'm not going to do that. I'm actually going to say no. And so I remind myself that I'm on a journey and I have small wins along the way that empower me. It's like a muscle you are using. And I was like, okay, if I did that, I might be able to say no to more things. So we'll see.
One thing I've found in terms of that is like inviting people in on my team, in my family, to let them know that this is the project that I'm working on. This particular, for example, saying no.
Yeah.
Do you do that? Do you let people know when you're like, here are the things that I'm working on, for example, saying no?
Yes. And actually, I'm very fortunate. I have this wonderful team at NACAC. I have a chief of staff and I have an assistant who, without those people in a large, complex organization, it's very difficult to stay organized. And actually, we sat down last year and we actually sat down in January to look at my calendar for the entire year, space some things out and almost predict, like, when will you be running out of steam? We need to put a pause in between there. But I've also been really transparent with them that I am working on the ability to say no. And so I would like for you to feel empowered to remind me when I come to you and say, that would be great, I'm going to go do that. For them to say, do you really want to do that? Are you sure you want to do that? We don't think that's a good idea. And so, and it's hard, I think, sometimes for people to do that because the idea is if the CEO wants to do it, then we should just do it. But it's great. I mean, they have pushed back on me several times already where they say, well, you can, but should you? And so surrounding yourself, not everyone's fortunate enough to have a team, but if you have a colleague in the counseling office, right? Or if you have a fellow admission counselor who, sits with you, just again, continuously reminding you, I'm here, I'm your accountability partner.
Oh, and keeping an eye on that when it's hard for me to lose sight of that. For me, it's like where I enter into this, part of why it's hard for me to say no is that I'm almost constantly caretaking.
Yes.
And it's like, this is my role in this life. I decided at some point when I was however many years old that I will help and take care of others and make sure that they are getting their needs met, because that's part of my job. And there are certainly some ways that we could be like, that's great, and that served me. And then I also don't recognize when it's happening, and it will just creep in. And one of the things that's helped me, this is with a recent conversation that I was having with one of my colleagues, is that there are certain things that we're on the long arc of. In other words, this one's going to take some time.
Yes. Yes.
Or I guess I'm saying to you now, as we're talking about this, like this caretaking thing is probably for me something that I'm on the long arc for.
And you have to celebrate the small wins. Like I will say, going back to the story about the trustee opportunity, that was a big win for me, right? On the journey, even though during that process, I was also like, why did my schedule become this again? I was beating myself up. But then I realized that had I not been on this self-care journey, I would have probably said yes to that opportunity.
Right.
And while I would have enjoyed it to a certain extent, again, I would be burned out. I would be giving time that I really don't have. Mm-hmm. So another thing that's helpful for me in the process, besides the accountability partners and surrounding myself, is always asking myself, before I say yes, what is my intention?
Ooh.
What is my intention, right? Because oftentimes we say yes, and the intention is, I don't want that person to be mad at me.
Yeah.
I don't want that person to be disappointed by me.
Yeah.
And so I now pause and I ask myself, like, why am I saying yes to that thing? And sometimes it's ego. I've written about this, so it's not I'm not telling tales out of school, but I taught a course at Harvard Graduate School of Education, and I was invited to teach again. And I paused and I said, this was again in the self-care journey. And I said, why am I doing this? And I realized that it wasn't because I loved it or because I wanted to impart knowledge, right? It was this institutional affiliation, which I found really interesting. And so many of us fall into those kinds of things, or like, oh, it would be nice to be affiliated, with Harvard Graduate School of Education, a place that I love, by the way. But again, I asked myself, what am I saying no to if I say yes to that opportunity? And it was, again, a lot of time that I don't have. But two, it was, I don't think I'm doing this for the right reasons. Yeah. I think this is ego talking. It's not actual, wanting to educate. And so I pulled out and I said, no, I'm not going to do that anymore. So, everybody has a version of this. It's hard because we're never going to get it 100% perfect.
Totally. I'm so vibing with what you're saying on this and my version of this because, I'm like nonviolent communication super fan is like, what need can I be tapped into? Like, what is the need underneath this? Like, what need is this opportunity fulfilling for me?
Right.
And is it a need for contribution, or is there something else, a need to be liked, a need to feel seen, or something like that? And I realized that I'm not able to feel into those things unless I have space.
Right.
To fill into those things. And if my schedule, and it's happened for me this year a couple of times too, where it's just, I've had these crazy weeks. If I don't have space to like come back and like actually feel my feelings, then it's not going to happen. And maybe we talked about this. My therapist at one point was like, do you have unscheduled time? And I was like,
what is that?
Excuse me? what do you mean? Kind of like two blinks. And he was like, times in your calendar where nothing is planned. And I was like, well, why would I do that?
Right. But life-changing because
totally.
You do it now, right?
I do
it as well.
So I want to switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about college admissions, bigger picture.
Is something happening in college admissions?
Ever and always?
Yes.
But I'm curious to hear from your perspective, based on what's happening in the world, where do you see things headed in the next 3 to 5 years in the college admissions landscape? Like, what are some of the changes that you foresee?
Well, I think the first thing that I will predict, and I am not a crystal ball guy, so I'll just preface it by saying that, but I think this constant change is actually our new normal. I do think, gosh, there's a quote, and I wish I could fully remember it, but it's by Justin Trudeau, and I showed it to the board of directors at NACAC the other day.
I thought you were going to say Justin Timberlake, and I was like,
yeah, I don't often quote Justin Timberlake or Justin Trudeau, to be fair, but he talks about the speed of change these days and the fact that this is actually the slowest it will ever be again.
Whoa.
And, just mind-blowing, right?
Yeah.
And I showed that to the board of directors at NACAC just to remind them, like, this is the speed we are going to work out now, and we're constantly going to be accelerating. I do think there's a lot of changes in the next 3 to 5 years. One thing that I think we have no idea what this is going to look like in terms of impact is artificial intelligence. I think it has probably already landed at our doorstep, and we're not necessarily fully understanding the beast ahead. Yeah. It's going to impact everything from essays, as I say this to the college essay guy. It's going to impact how colleges and universities are evaluating applications, access to information. So that's even advising. I think it's going to be really interesting. I think the way students connect to colleges is also going to continue to evolve, and I know NACAC wants to play a role in that through our college fairs and reinventing some of our programs. But this whole notion that you turn 16 years old and you take a PSAT and then colleges start connecting with you, I think that's going to evolve, and it probably should, right? And so I think that's going to be really different. And I also do think how we evaluate students over time is going to change. I think, our values have shifted. I think the test optional movement is something that has really sort of had a huge impact on colleges and universities, but it's also kind of the opening for what else have we been taking for granted in this process that maybe hasn't suited us well in the past. And so I know that's probably not the answer you were looking for, but the answer is buckle up, friends, because there's a lot more change coming.
Yeah. So how does that have you when you're talking to folks on your team or in the profession? How is that shifting the way that you're talking to folks? What's becoming, this is kind of a leading question, but what do you feel like is becoming more important for folks to do focus on? Like, so what do we do as a result of this? So what?
Yeah, I think nimbleness is going to have to be our new normal. On our team at NACAC, we always talk about meeting the moment. Because the way it seems to work these days is news drops and immediately our members are asking, what is NACAC doing about that? Right. And so there is a nimbleness that we have to have, but also an ability to respond very quickly, although thoughtfully. Yeah. And I also think bringing people together, like that's what I'm most passionate about right now, because what I am disturbed by, to be 100% honest, is that as the challenges in the college admission counseling profession continue to rise, we're beating each other up and throwing the daggers at each other. That's not useful. So part of what I think about deeply is how can I use this platform that I've been given? How can I use the work of the association to bring people together? So we're thinking about how we strategically use our conference, the kind of education and training we're doing, the advocacy, but even how we make people feel when they arrive at our events. And we're thinking deeply about every single one of those things to try to bring the profession together. I feel like more and more we're dividing ourselves between K-12 and higher ed. Higher ed blaming counselors and counselors blaming admission officers. And to a certain extent, we're all feeling an extraordinary amount of pressure around all of these changes. But if we don't join forces, it's not going to get any easier. And so for me, that's something that's just top of mind every day.
One thing that we've never really talked about is the ban on race-conscious admission, on how the impacts that that's had on colleges and where you see things headed.
Yeah, well, to be honest, we don't know exactly what the impact is yet because we're in the first year, right? And I'm calling this the year of calibration and trying to figure out how are institutions going to do this differently? What's the impact going to be across the country? I will say that one of the impacts that I have seen and that many high school counselors have told me about is the psychological impact that it's had on students.
Yeah, say more about that.
Well, the reality is the adults in the room, so the counselors and people who do this work like me and you, we were steeped in that work and we understood what the Supreme Court case was about, what the implications were. Students just hear on the news race was taken away as a factor in college admission. Many students have interpreted that as colleges don't want me anymore.
Will you speak to those students, like, and disavow them of that, essentially?
Yeah, well, I'm glad because every opportunity I've had,
please,
I have said, there is nothing further from the truth. Colleges just want you now more than ever. And just because the Supreme Court took away, the ability for college admission officers to use race in admission has not taken away the passion that colleges and universities have for a diverse class every single year. And so, this is a role I think NACAC can play, is we've been trying to create a movement around the country through our members, through using the media, all of these different facets to ensure that students know, don't drop out of the process, engage. Colleges want you now more than ever.
Great. So I'd love to get practical for a second. For college counselors, for students going through this process, what advice would you give to them in this new landscape?
Yeah. In some ways things are different, but in some ways, in terms of the college admissions process, things are exactly the same. You do the work that you will as a high school student, and you go through the application process. What may be a little bit different is that you may want to advocate for yourself or tell a deeper part of your own personal story, and particularly as it relates to your identity in your essay, for example. Or maybe high school counselors might want to tell a little bit more about the lived experience of a student in the recommendation letter. But what I don't want students to feel, and I hope you're all hearing me closely, is that you don't have to tell a trauma story to get into college.
Yes.
I will tell you that while I've been very appreciative of the Biden-Harris administration and how supportive they have been in ensuring that colleges and universities remain diverse, I will never forget that when the decision dropped, President Biden came out on the Garden and he talked about students overcoming adversity and that we need to admit students who are challenged with adversity. And yes, I agree with him, but I don't want people to equate being a student of color with adversity. Right. Not all students of color are facing adversity, and you don't have to tell a trauma story to get into college. And so the reason I say some things are different, but some things also stay the same is really the advice that I'm giving students is tell the story you want to tell. Don't feel pressured to tell a story about your lived experience or your identity or your race if that is not what's in your heart and you want to share with an admissions office.
Yeah. For those counselors and students who are listening to this and are like nodding along, counselors who are nodding along, we'll link in the show notes. There's past podcasts we did on, literally the title was Why You Don't Have to Write About Trauma in Your Personal Statement.
Yes.
And it gives like some other practical ideas and, brainstorming how to actually help students get there. Students, if you're listening, we've got practical resources on this. So we'll link to them in the show notes. Quick side note.
Great.
So one of the things we're hearing about sort of in the media and oftentimes in the political landscape is about the value of a college degree. Is college still worth it?
Absolutely. But let me tell you, I get very emotional about this topic, so I'm going to try to be brief. One of the presentations I gave recently, I showed a data point, 56%. This was a Wall Street Journal poll. 56% of their readers have said that college isn't worth it. Let's take that with a grain of salt, because the Wall Street Journal has amongst the most educated readership in the world. My guess is they wouldn't say that to their children. They're talking about other people's children. And so I think it's very dangerous, the road that we're going down, where we have politicians talking about you don't need to go to a four-year college, you don't need an education, because that's not the advice they're giving to their own children. So I want to preface it by saying that. But all of the data still proves that going to college, one, is the fastest way upward in socioeconomic mobility. But over your lifetime, you are going to make so much more money if you actually go to college. And there's all this data about you live a healthier life, you're more civically engaged. But the other piece that I think is really important to note, and I talked a little bit about this because I live in DC, and right next door to me in Maryland, the governor has removed certain requirements, actually college requirements for entry-level jobs in the state, which is great. It's a great entry point. However, you will hit a glass ceiling pretty quickly if you don't get a degree. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's what I want people to know and to understand, that yes, you might get an entry-level job, but if you really aspire to moving up in the profession, at some point you will hit a ceiling if you don't get the degree. So college is still very much worth it. Don't let others fool you into believing otherwise.
As you look ahead, do you find yourself, when you think about the college admission landscape, do you find yourself mostly optimistic or pessimistic?
I am an optimist by nature, and I wouldn't do this work if I wasn't optimistic. I think we are in a period of extraordinary change, and I do think what's on the other side is probably really exciting, but we're in the messy, murky, painful period of change. But that other side is going to be a new college admission process and a new college admission journey, but we have to get through this messy period first.
So as we wrap here, I'm curious, what would you like to say if you were speaking to, let's say, thousands and thousands of counselors, as you often do? What advice would you give folks as they're thinking about navigating this uncertainty and a rapidly changing world?
Well, I would say to high school counselors, one, I understand the frustration, but at the same time, I also just want to share gratitude because what they do changes people's lives. I mean, I am here talking to you today because a high school counselor at my public school tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Young man, have you ever thought about going to college?" And she had 600 kids in her caseload, and I was a low-income kid who had no idea what college was about, right? And so regardless of the challenges that we have in this profession, the work is so critically important to the future of young people, and by the way, to the future of a nation and our world.
Yeah.
And so sticking with it and being patient with us, and also I would say this to both sides, not just school counselors, but also higher education professionals, having grace for each other. This goes back to what I was talking about, that I think in times of intensity, our inclination to throw daggers and beat each other up continues to grow. And there's no value in that. We're not getting anywhere with it. And so showing each other some grace in this really messy period. I have the privilege of being on the ground with members all over the country and the world, and I can really confidently say most people are just doing the best they can under really difficult circumstances. Yeah, and for college admission officers, I want to also just extend my deepest empathy. I think it is a really hard job. While I, by the way, still think it is the best job you can have, because I did it for over 20 years, I also know how much more complicated it is these days to bring in a first-year class, and the extraordinary pressures that they are feeling that are mostly external. And so what I would like to say, just like school counselors, your work is so critical. You are changing the lives of thousands of people. And I really want people to stick with it. I worry about the fact that there's so much turnover in college admission and that people aren't staying and wanting to move up the ranks. And institutions need a lot of support. And so that's one area I know that I'm focusing on at NACAC. But stick with it. You are changing lives.
So I want to end here on the personal, and I want to ask you, let's say we do this again in a year. I don't know if we'll record another podcast in a year, but what...
If you bring the fireplace in there.
You get to sit on the side. What, a year from now, what's shifted in your life? What's different a year from now?
On a personal note?
On a personal note.
Yeah, I would like to say to you when we open up the self-care conversation that I have gotten much better at the management of my schedule and at saying no, that I have continued to evolve in that direction. I know it's not going to be perfect, but I want it to be much better than it is right now.
Mm-hmm. Lovely.
How about you? I'm curious.
For me, I would love to be able to say that I've had this sort of in the back of my mind, like this athlete identity that I left behind in high school. And I've been sort of like wanting to like summon that. And so I'd love to be able to say to you a year from now, I'm like sitting up straight as I say it, that I have like tapped back into that athlete identity, and that on a regular basis, I'm doing cardio, and that I'm doing something a little bit each day as it relates to calisthenics or strength training. So it's like very practical in the weeds. I'd love to be like, yeah, I've been able to like sort of summon that athlete identity, and I'll be
44 by then. I'd love to say at 44, like I'm in the best shape that I've been in, let's say, 10 years, because I think that's really when things sort of fell off for me.
So if I text you as an accountability partner, like every couple of months about this, like how's it going, would that stress you out?
No, that would
you
excite
be
me.
Okay with
I
that?
would welcome that.
Okay, I'm going to do it.
Great.